Tonight we have a special broadcast about global climate change in Japan. We will go over the history of Japan, some opportunities and vulnerabilities, and recommendations we have for the future of Japan.
In the 1800s to the 1850s, the Japan government encountered financial problems because taxation was based on agriculture while the economy was becoming more commercialized. In 1850, economic growth was slowing as technological limitations hindered agricultural growth and population increase. In 1853, an American naval squadron commanded by Matthew Perry forced the opening of Japan to the west. In 1868, stresses caused by isolation caused by foreign intervention ended with the proclamation of rule by their emperor. In 1870, a Ministry of Industry was created to establish overall economic policy and operate certain industries. In 1871, they expanded state power to carry out economic and social change, and in the 1900s, they were fully engaged in an industrial revolution. This first chart shows the size of the Japanese merchant fleet in various years from 1873 to 1913. This next chart shows the railroad mileage in Japan in various years from 1873 to 1913. This last chart shows the coal production in Japan in various years from 1875 to 1913.
There's some information about history of fossil fuel in Japan. Japan is the world's largest liquefied natural gas importer, second largest coal importer, and third largest net importer of crude oil and oil products. In 2008, 10 years after the signing of the Kyoto Protocol, Japan's total greenhouse gas emissions are rounded to 1,286 million tons, of which over 90% was CO2 emissions caused by the burning of the fossil fuels. Japanese government in the Meiji era realized that the use of coal was effective during industrialization, encouraged the development of coal mines. And there are top 10 coal-burning countries. As you can see, Japan is the 6th country in the world.
This chart shows the historical emissions in Japan. The red line was the agreed Kyoto emissions allowances. As you can see from the chart, the black line has exceeded the red line's allowance. Additionally, these pie charts show Japan's imports by source and also Japan's total energy consumption. As you can see, petroleum and other liquids take up a huge amount of their energy consumption.
This is history of deforestation in Japan period. Nora started to construct huge temple strings and body image, which demand high quality of growth software. Post-war period, Japan's government delivered large-scale democracy per wood as long as term strategy. 1960, short age, Japan government strong large-scale national land development. 1980, 1990, more than 500,000 houses were being destroyed every year due to the urban redevelopment and other reasons. This is a chart about deforestation impact on carbon footprint.
For history of generation in Japan, Japan is taking action to mitigate these challenges and create a model of a sustainable society by drawing on its unique historical knowledge and combining it with today's technology and human resource. Government and the public sector could turn to cycling economy by reusing timber resources. Input of new raw materials in the system is reduced and had stimulated the challenge that slowed down deforestation and eventually led to the reforestation of Japan.
So now we will talk more about the lifestyle in Japan. As you can see, the average per capita of net adjusted disposable income is about $25,000 per year. And the average of the top 20% of the population is 54,000, and the average of the bottom 20% of the population is nearly 8,000. As you can see, there's a huge gap between the top and the bottom. Also, their capacity to adapt is not very good. Japan is dependent on fossil fuels for 80% of its primary energy supply, and 90% of these fossil fuels are imported. There are several vulnerable populations in Japan. First, elders are at increased risk for heat strokes and are more susceptible to sickness. Women have to compete against men for jobs and are responsible for household upkeep. The lower class is also vulnerable because they can't afford health care and are uneducated because they have to work. Children are also vulnerable because they're required to do labor-intensive work, have a weak immune system to fight off diseases, and are unable to attend school because they have to work. Agricultural workers are the final vulnerable population, and that's because they have an invasive stink bug that is destroying their crops, and the temperature changes are preventing certain crops from growing in their farms.
One of the opportunities Japan has is to reduce the CO2 with technology. They have a potential to reduce its CO2 emissions by 70% of the 1990 level by the year 2050. Another thing that they have as an opportunity is the businesses. They will need to spend money on new technology. Lastly, the politicians and the government will need to pass legislation to enact change. If you put a price on carbon emissions through emissions trading or tax, the shift to a low carbon economy could create markets for low carbon technologies worth over $500 billion by 2050. Another opportunity Japan has is to expand renewable energy. A lot of Japanese companies utilize green power certification and carbon credit schemes around the world, aiming to further reduce greenhouse gas and expand renewable energy. Climate change is creating new business opportunities for companies from new regulatory frameworks and from changing consumer demand. We can enhance reputation due to climate change performance and make a profit off of it.
This is the opportunity to reduce electrical waste. Japan has electrical waste problem. Japan did not have enough money to train the workers. I suppose electric company maybe the electric company can help pay train the workers. Political government they can make a PSA profit with all these information. Hopefully, Japan can reduce the electrical. This is another opportunity for revive endangered species. Japan has outlawed the hunting whales, which was one of their major reports. The government made a program called New Prairie, calls for talking 333 whales a year for the next 12 years, additional to other new lateral research. Japan wanted to increase the pollution of whales. They made a goal of 3,000 over 10 years.
There's one of their vulnerability is temperatures are rising. For ecological part, Japan's average temperature over the long term has been on an upward trend rising at the rate of 1.15 Celsius per 100 years, which is higher than the global average of 0.68 Celsius per 100 years. And another one is sea surface temperature in the waters around Japan expected to increase over in the long term. And the impact for that is the number of annual deaths from heat stroke since 1995 has been trending upward over time. Another vulnerability is agriculture industry, and rice yields and quality has been steadily decline due to high temperatures, and the southern green sticking bug and the pest that lives on rice, wheat, and soybean plants are expanding northward as temperatures rise. And for economic field, rural ecosystems that have protected Japan has become undermanaged as farming communities decline, and the total production of the paddy rice is likely to decrease by 12 to 13% in the middle of this century. And the last part for cultural field is global warming will change what and where food is growing in the country and what people consume.
Another vulnerability of Japan is that natural ecosystems are being destroyed. Researchers found that some catches of coastal species may decline by as much as 70% by 2100. They recorded red tides in Japan, which can be responsible for large-scale fish deaths. Also, there are between 20 to 50 episodes of red tides that cause damage to fisheries on the order of hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of yen each year. With less than 2% of the world's population, Japan accounts for about 10% of the global fisheries catch. That means that Japanese people eat more than 4 times the world average in fish, and citizens would need to adjust their traditional cooking styles to decrease this intake. Japan is also vulnerable because of the increase in risk of natural disasters. Water quality is expected to decline with a warmer climate. Warmer water contains less dissolved oxygen, which leads to less biological breakdown of disruptive chemicals. Typhoons are expected to become more severe, and future typhoons will have higher maximum peak winds and greater rainfall as indicated by the red areas in this figure 1. Citizens of Japan will be displaced by disasters in the region, and landmarks and destinations important to the culture of Japan may be destroyed by natural disasters.
This next picture shows the expansion of areas subject to storm surge risk in Japan's 3 major bays. The area at risk for damage from storm surges will expand. The orange shows what it currently is, and the red shows what it is after sea level rise. As you can see, Tokyo Bay is in the most risk for a high sea level rise. Another vulnerability is the increased risk of flooding. Floods may exceed the river's prescribed target flood safety levels to be 1.8 to 4.4 times the current value. Businesses will suffer in areas affected by floods, and the insurance rates will increase. Lastly, 46% of Japan's population and 47% of Japan's industrial output are at threat from sea level rise and associated impacts such as storm surges, typhoons, and coastal erosion.
This is vulnerable population decline. Demographics are changing. Today, 1 in 4 are over 65 years old. By 2035, will be 1 in 3. By 2060, 2 in 5 will be over 65 years old. The older age groups are more sensitive to change in temperature. Social, the cost of living has increased because of the protests from more extreme weather events. People may not want to live somewhere with high costs of living.
There are many recommendations for ways that Japan can reduce their carbon emissions. One is to reopen nuclear power plants that were closed.
The trade-off is the population of Japan may be frightened and revolt against the decision.
An additional recommendation is to reduce imports of coal and crude oil.
The trade-off is having less resources to make goods that they export.
The public sector could turn to a recycling economy to slow down deforestation.
The trade-off would be wood harvesters will have less work, which leads them to making less money, and there will be less jobs overall.
They could also change farming techniques, then use less fertilizer.
The trade-off would be it would affect the growth of the crops.
Lastly, they could reduce the catch of fish.
The trade-off for this would be the Japanese diet would decrease from 40% of the protein intake. There would be less protein in their diets.
Japan's history of involvement with UNFCCC. In 1992, Japan attended their first COP as a UNFCCC member, and in 1997, they hosted the third COP. In 1998, they showed initial support for the climate change program. In 1999, helped to create guidelines for measures to prevent global warming. At 2002, the Japanese government adopted the revised climate change program. In 2005, Japan's government approved the Kyoto Protocol Target Achievement Plan drafted by the Global Warming Prevention Headquarters. And in the last year, which is 2015, at the COP in Paris, France, Japan agreed to adopt a scheme intended to reduce emissions and voluntarily carry them out.
There are several major instances in which Japan has attempted to reduce their overall carbon emissions. Their first major instance was when they did the Third Conference of the Parties, hosted in Kyoto, Japan on December 1st through 11th, 1997. Over 10,000 participants attended, and they held intense formal and informal negotiations about the Kyoto Protocol for nearly a week and a half. Parties to the FCCC adopted the Kyoto Protocol on December 11th, 1997. Parties in Annex 1 of the FCCC agreed to commitments to reduce their overall emissions of 6 greenhouse gases by at least 5% below 1990 levels between 2008 and 2012. They also established emissions trading and joint implementation between Annex 1 countries. Lastly, they created a clean development mechanism to encourage joint emission reduction projects between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries.
Japan's second major instance was when they attended the COP21 in Paris, France from November 30th, 2015 to December 12, 2015. They announced plans to decrease its emissions by 26% by 2030 from their 2013 level. They agreed to start a discussion with business circles and the government about strengthening the carbon tax system, introducing a full cap-and-trade system. Another major instance is Japan's stance on joint implementation. It is one of 3 flexibility mechanisms set out in the Kyoto Protocol to help countries with binding greenhouse gas emissions targets meet their obligations. In 2012, the owner of Tokyo Electric Power Incorporation announced that it would no longer buy UN credits to offset its emissions. Due to massive losses, the Japanese national government has had to bail out the company in addition to helping them with compensation claims for damages. Because of the long joint implementation approval process and expensive emission reduction through joint implementation, Japan sees the potential of a new credit mechanism.
And the fourth major instance is the CDM Executive Board 73rd meeting, which took place at Bonn, Germany from 27th to 31st May 2013. The clean development mechanism is a key tool in the Kyoto Protocol, allowing countries with emission reduction targets to undertake and benefit from the greenhouse gas emission reductions in other countries. And the board approved the first 2 standardized baselines. The first one is gross emissions factor for the Southern African power poor, and the second is fuel and technology switch to reduce methane destructions in the charcoal sector of the Uganda. Japan considers the CDM rules on additionality as excessively strict and complex. Japan has advocated a fundamental shift from judging to checking, moving to a positive list approach, or where this is not possible, increased use of default parameters.
Major incident number 5. Japan has agreed to introduce renewable energy source on a large scale and carry out much more serious energy saving effort. Japan agreed to undertake estimate reducing contribute to reducing global greenhouse gas. Japan INDC is higher, transparent, and concerns.
The climate consultants have come up with several recommendations for how Japan can reduce their emissions. First, they recommend expanding the successful Tokyo Cap-and-Trade program into other major cities in Japan. This Tokyo program created a plan to force large-scale facilities that have total consumption, fuels, heating, and electricity of at least 1,500 kilometers per year to reduce their emissions. Their allowances were their base year emissions times compliance factor times compliance period, and the base year is calculated by taking the average CO2 emissions during 3 consecutive years. Participants are required to report their verified emissions to TMG annually, and if violated, monetary fines of about 500,000 yen will be imposed and the violation will be released to the public. Climate consultants also recommend that Japan develops new countrywide standards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by improving efficiency. They should establish federal energy efficiency requirements for refrigerators, lights, and other appliances. They should also develop strict building codes that require contractors to use better insulation and greener designs. They should ban energy inefficient devices in commercial stores. And lastly, they should require government infrastructure and related buildings to utilize energy efficient light bulbs.
Another recommendation is to invest money into research and development of mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through green energy. We recommend creating think tank labs to test out potential operations and methods and invite professors from universities to communicate ideas and solutions. We also recommend enlisting research and development facilities to only create products that have no carbon footprint. Lastly, we recommend to create a scholarship program for college students to submit innovative green energy ideas. We also recommend that Japan should make it a priority to attend the global stocktake every 5 years. By doing so, we can evaluate the progress towards goals, and we can use this meeting to meet with other countries to learn research they've discovered to help them meet reduction goals. We can help create new progressive goals, but we have to make sure that the time frame is realistic. Many countries felt that the Kyoto Protocol gave too short of a time period to achieve these changes.
The Japanese government only have limited paid positions that are dedicated to environmental conservation, so we recommend that create more positions within the government that are dedicated to ensure compliance. First, oversee cap and trade programs in major cities, host think tank forum to facilitate new ideas, and be ambassadors of programs aimed at reducing emissions. For cost-benefit analysis, there will be new expenses incurred to implement our recommendations. These recommendations are necessary, and the companies will save money over the long run with new efficiencies. The cap and trade program may damage some businesses' profitabilities. They will face fines if they don't meet the standards, and it's unavoidable. The cap and trade program affects government-run buildings. The government should be the leader in implementing programs to reduce emissions, and Japanese government needs to be paid higher new employees to work towards environmental conservation.
Social analyze. Business will be negatively impacted by the cap and trade program. Schools may have to close down if they cannot afford the fines. Application notification who do not comply with new standards made to go out of business needs to make their application more energy efficient. Vulnerable parties. Women should not be heavily impacted by our recommendation. Children may be affected if their schools are closed because they cannot comply with a cap and trade program.
The climate consultants took part in a role play with international committees from other countries. And our recommendations after the role play is that hospitals and schools will be initially exempt from the cap and trade program. This would be unbeneficial for them to close because of having to pay fines by not reducing their emissions enough, and it will protect vulnerable populations from being affected. The new government environmental positions will also serve as ambassadors in Japan as well as in other countries. They will attend the global stocktake to take part in the international discussions.
Thank you for joining us tonight for our special news broadcast about global climate change in Japan.